AI crochet is scamming your grandmother as we speak. That was the headline on the most fascinating and disturbing article that I got to read this week. Laura Robinson is a reporter with a serious crochet habit. And as such, she's apparently plugged into various knitting and crocheting centered Facebook groups. She started noticing a trend of odd, too perfect looking pictures connected to crochet patterns for sale on those various groups. She realized that they would eventually be taken down as people started complaining that the patterns were fakes. But what she didn't realize until she went undercover as one of these individuals who was looking for the fake patterns was that the real scam wasn't in getting the money for the pattern. The real scam was in using those AI images to identify people who couldn't tell the difference between the AI and the real thing, and then aggressively targeting them for more destructive scams designed to take as much as they could from the most vulnerable folks online, quilting grannies. Miss Robinson posed as a target and was immediately bombarded not only by links to try to get viruses installed on her computer, though there were those, but also through more sophisticated and nefarious schemes, like pages built off of public figures who didn't have a real Facebook page of their own, but using publicly available data to construct what looked like the real page of a career Army widower looking for love late in life in order to scam lonely folks out of their checkbooks. Programs that were tried to install on the computer that would control what the individual would see on the screen with a fake version of it so that they could harvest bank passwords, security questions, and all sorts of other specialized scams designed to victimize the virtually vulnerable. The point of the story is this. We live in a world in which it is increasingly difficult to tell what is real and what is fake. And please, don't fool yourself into thinking this is just a generational thing. This is an online granny's problem. A bank in Hong Kong was recently robbed to the tune of $25 million because scammers collected enough footage and audio recordings of a group of bank employees that they were able to create AI versions of them, invite one real person into a video call with all the fake people, and have the fake workers, including that person's fake boss, order him to transfer $25 million to an untraceable bank account in a non-extradition treaty country. This is an all-of-us problem, and it's a problem that runs a lot deeper than artificial intelligence. It's a problem that way outdates it. This is a problem that has led to us creating a media ecosystem in which we never have to be confronted with information that challenges us if we so desire. It's a problem that has led us to a social media system that pressures us all to put on a mask of perfection all the time, a mask that is afflicting our kids and teens with anxiety, depression, and mental health issues. It's a problem that starts with a defect in our human hearts. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to look at what the Bible has to say about truth and falsehood and telling the difference between them, a concept that the Bible often refers to as discernment. Because if we're going to, this series we're going through is church politics, getting things done together. If we're going to get things done together as human beings, whether it's in the Capitol building or in the kitchen of our homes, we're going to need to figure out what is the truth of the world that we live in. So we're going to dive in by talking about what is wrong with us that we have so much trouble seeing the truth. We're going to read Romans 12:2, which is going to be the pattern for our look into discernment this week. Do not be conformed to this world, or to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I heard once that in preaching, before you can get people found, you got to get them good and lost. Well, friends, when it comes to seeing the truth, seeing God's world in God's way, we as human beings are naturally, and if it's left in and of ourselves, hopelessly lost. We are prone to, as Paul puts it there in Romans, falling into the pattern of the world, falling for it. He's talking about the stuff that we just assume is true, whether or not we've ever thought about whether it actually is, or how it lines up with how God would have us see the world. This pattern shows up anywhere that we as Christians prize a version of the world that exists in our minds without examining it against the reality of Scripture. Whether it's a version of the world that we hear about from a political party, a media company, a social media influencer, or just the families and communities in which we grow up. Whatever we accept as true that conflicts with how the Bible would have us see the world, that is us conforming to the pattern of the world. And sometimes we do that just because we don't even realize we're doing it. We don't know any better. That's how I grew up. It's what I assumed. It's what I learned. And we just never thought to check it against the Bible. It's how we work as human beings. Tim Keller once wrote, "If we are not deliberately thinking about our culture and our context, we will be conformed to it without ever knowing." So there are times that we conform to the pattern of the world, even as Christians, just because we never thought about it. We didn't put the thought in. We didn't really examine the assumptions we were making about the world around us. But sometimes we conform because the influences of the world aren't just the normal, hey, the world is broken, it doesn't line up with God's reality perfectly anymore. Sometimes we are pulled away from the truth by the active interference of bad actors, individuals or groups who would confuse and confound our view of the truth in order to accomplish their own ends. We're going to read about those in Colossians 2 and 1 Corinthians 11 here. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. And then later in 2 Corinthians, for such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as the apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. Both of these passages look at the reality that within our broken human systems, our broken human world, there will be people who want to actively drag others away from truth for personal gain, satisfaction, or power. Personally, I'm a really big proponent of, I love the Westminster Larger and Shorter Catechism. It's a series of questions that was originally designed to teach children and new converts, what do we believe as Christians? And in the Westminster Larger Catechism, it talks about how as you look at God's commandments, in the 10 Commandments, one of the implications of the 9th commandment is that I should believe the best about others until proved otherwise. Like basically, I should love others well by believing the best about them until proven otherwise. This passage here is kind of the necessary balance to that. Next week, we're going to talk more about charity, humility, that Westminster Larger Catechism stuff. But this balances it out. It says, yes, these verses about false teachers, it says, yes, you should assume the best about others until proven otherwise, but you should also know that that's not always going to be true. You should exist with an understanding that that's not always or even often going to be the case. This is the necessary balance to the kind of relational optimism that we want to practice as Christians. The American author Herman Melville was once reading a book by his contemporary, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He came to a passage where Emerson wrote, "Trust men and they will be true to you." Melville wrote in the margin, "God help the poor fellow who squares his life according to this." As Christians, we have to acknowledge this about the broken world in which we live. We cannot just default trust someone because they say they are a Christian or they say they are on our side in whatever given cultural debate we're engaging in. We have to examine whether what they are saying conforms to the pattern of the world or conforms to the pattern we find in Scripture. We have to examine everything off of the Bible. If a person you don't personally know, who doesn't personally care about you, tells you something that seems designed to make you angry or scared, it probably was, and they're probably finding a way to profit from it. This is that discernment that we're getting into. If that article on Facebook, that post, seems to confirm all of your pre-held beliefs and makes you feel puffed up like the smartest person in the world because you're exactly right about everything, we better check where it came from because it might have been written to make you feel that way and to benefit off of it somehow. We have to know that there are negative actors in the world who are seeking to draw us away from the truth, and sometimes they'll disguise themselves as being on our side. In The Lord of the Rings, Thea and Caden and I are reading through The Lord of the Rings for the first time, and we're up to about 3/4 of the way through Fellowship of the Ring. And when the hobbits are trying to escape the Shire, they're sneaking out, the evil is pursuing them, and they're trying to get away, they meet a character named Aragorn. And Aragorn's a friend. He's an ally. In fact, he's the king in exile. He's there to help them get safely to where they need to go. But they don't know that. They were never warned that that was what his role was going to be. They've never met him before, and he just shows up out of the blue. And they have to decide, are we going to trust this person or not? Are we going to go with him and lean on his experience, his help, or are we going to sneak off on our own and try to get away from this person? And at the moment of decision, Frodo says to him, "You have frightened me several times tonight, but never in the way that the servants of the enemy would, or so I imagine. I think one of his spies would, well, seem fairer and feel fouler, if you understand." Friends, we as Christians who are trying to be discerning, we have to watch out for people who seem fair but feel foul, whose words appeal to something inside of us, but ultimately draw us towards a worldly pattern of thought and deed. Okay, one last thing before we start getting found. One last thing where we're lost. We've talked about some things out there that pull us away from the truth. It's important that we also acknowledge the things in here that pull us away from the truth. Simply put, sometimes we like being lost. We want to conform to the patterns of the world, or maybe put more accurately, we want to find a pattern out there in the world that conforms to me and helps me live the way I want to live. 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 4 says, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." This is a really common pattern here. It's clearly a pattern that has been happening all throughout history. Paul is warning Timothy about it 2,000 years ago. But I think in many ways this is a path that is more accessible to us today than it maybe ever has been in history. Because 50 or 100 years ago, if I wanted news, I listened to CBS or ABC, I read a major newspaper. We could disagree on our reasons, our hows and whys in a conversation, but for the most part, much more so than today at least, we were working with the same whats, the same facts, the same basic reality. Today, if I want to live my life never once seeing an opinion that challenges my own, I can do that easily. If I never want to get exposed to the other side of a cultural debate, a political divide, a religious reality, I can do that. I can bubble myself like crazy. I can, as Paul puts it here in 2 Timothy, only hear what my itching ears want to hear. So we as human beings, we tend to get lost just because of the culture we live in. We tend to get lost because of bad actors out in the culture around us. And we tend to get lost because sometimes I just want to be lost. I want the world to conform to my desires rather than the truth of the Scriptures. So let's get into how we get found. How do I get away from the patterns of the world that pull on me so naturally? We're going to read Romans 12:2 again, and then John 14 and Philippians 4. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And then John 14, Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Philippians 4. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Romans tells us that the alternative to being conformed to the pattern of the world is to be transformed. It says, instead be transformed in the renewal of your mind. And that word itself is actually all we really need to see the pattern that Paul is pushing us towards here, because there's only 3 other places in the New Testament where that word shows up. 2 of them, actually all of them, in some way, shape, or form relate to who Jesus is. 2 of them we find in the Gospels accounts of the Mount of Transfiguration. It's actually the Greek word transformation. When Jesus goes on the mountain, some of his disciples go with, and they see a glimpse of who Jesus really is, of man and God united together, of Jesus, the Son of Man and Son of God. And then the 4th reference comes to us in 2 Corinthians 3:18, where it says, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of God, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. That beholding the glory of the Lord, all 3 of the other references to transformation are, I see who God is, I see who Jesus is, and it changes me. I am transformed not by wishing harder, working. I am transformed because I've seen God, and that changes me as a person. The way we avoid falling under the power of the patterns of the world is that we fall under the power of a stronger, better, purer, more beautiful pattern that we find in Jesus. The Puritans had a phrase that I absolutely love. They talked about the expulsive power of a new affection. Is part of the reason I love that the fact that the word expulsive is just really, really fun? Yes, it is. But I also love the idea behind it, the pattern. They're talking about how they believed that you couldn't properly or completely drive a sin out of a human life by that person hating it enough, or denying themselves enough, or by running away fast enough. They believed that in order to find true freedom from a sin, you had to find something better to occupy its place in your life. You had to find something to take the place of where that sin once held sway. Jesus once told a parable. He said there once was a demon who was living in a certain place. The demon went out and roamed around the world, and it came back to that original place and found it empty. And so the demon moved in and brought all of its friends. It's one of the weirdest parables that Jesus ever does. Most of his parables are about people, not about spiritual forces. But he's trying to do this he's trying to embody evil. He's saying, imagine evil itself as this personalized force in the demon. He says, if it goes out, if you manage to get rid of it, and it comes back and there's nothing new there, it's just going to come back. It may come back in a different form. It may come back in a different way. It may come back at a different time. But it's going to come back. That evil will return to our lives. Like that failure to launch demon, if we try to leave our lives empty, we won't escape the patterns of the world around us. We as human beings cannot be a void of meaning, of purpose, of identity, of truth. We need those things. We're going to find them somewhere. The question is where. And our passage there in John told us that the only perfect place to find those things is in Jesus. We worship a God who doesn't say, come to me and I will show you truth. We worship a God who says, I am truth. You won't find it outside of me. And so if we, as that 2 Corinthians passage put, if we are being transformed more and more into God's image, that means that it is as we become more like Jesus that we become more and more people of the truth. People who can resist the pull of the patterns of the world on our minds and our hearts and see the truth in Jesus instead. And we don't do that by hating the patterns of the world more, by being angrier or more bitter about them. We do it by focusing more and more on God. Think about that Philippians 4 passage again. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, dwell on those things. Those things are all ultimately found in Jesus. We see echoes of them, good and right and true and excellent echoes in the world around us, in the people around us. But if we understand those echoes rightly, they are all there to point us to the way they find their fulfillment in Jesus, their wholeness in Him. So the core of our answer, how do I avoid falling into these patterns of the world, is that I have to put my eyes more and more on Jesus. Whatever is noble, true, beautiful, pure, think on these things. Focus on them. Keep your eyes set on them. Focus on the characteristics that Paul lays out there, the good, the true, the noble, the pure, the things that point us back to Jesus. But also think about the gospel itself, the good news that in our propensity to fall for lies, the truth came for us. That in our practice of listening to bad actors, a perfectly good person came to give himself for us. That in our desire as human beings to plug our ears and only listen to the things we like, and when we hear something we don't like, say, no, I can't hear you. Like, in the midst of all of that, the power of the voice of God came into our world, projected into our darkness, and said, you are mine. I created you. I love you, and you have a purpose. That's what we keep our eyes focused on. And if we know that, if we see that, if we believe that story that's just been told about who Jesus is and what He's done for us, then how do I grow in it? How do I get closer? How do I dwell better? How do I seek more the pattern of Jesus and avoid the worldly patterns around me? The very end of Romans 12:2 gives us an answer there. So we don't conform to the pattern of this world. We're transformed by the renewal of our mind. And it says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good and pleasing and perfect will. That process where it talks about testing and approving God's will, testing the things of the world around us, that's discernment. That's what the Bible means when it uses the word discernment. So if that's our goal, a transformed view of the world through discernment, let's talk about practicing discernment. Two main lessons as we close here this morning. The first is, in order to practice discernment, we need to practice discernment. Yes, these are the intellectual depths in which you are swimming here at Hope. Try not to be intimidated. But seriously, over and over throughout the Bible, it uses the language of practicing discernment, training in discernment, growth in discernment. It's giving us this picture of something where I need to work at it. I need to grow in it. It's not going to be there day one. If you're doing nothing athletic in life, like I often am, I can't jump off my couch and run a marathon tomorrow. That's just not possible. If I want to do that, I have to work, I have to train, I have to grow, I have to push, and it's going to take a long time to get there. The old saying goes that if salvation is surrender, if coming to God, realizing my need for Him, accepting what He has done for me on the cross is surrender, sanctification is war. Growing into who God has made me to be, driving away the sinful things that I have grabbed onto in the past, mortifying those sins, becoming more like Jesus. If salvation is surrender, sanctification is war. And that is true of discernment. It takes effort. It takes work. And if that's the case, be encouraged to not give up on it just because you're not perfect in it. Especially if you're early in the process of learning and praying about, God, what would you have me do as far as I'm learning what discernment looks like in my life? But also, don't assume you're done learning about it just because you've gotten to a certain point in your development. If I'm an elite athlete who's running those marathons in 2 hours and 4 minutes or whatever ridiculous stuff they're pulling off these days, and I stop training, I'm going to fall off a cliff pretty quickly. We have to keep going. We have to keep training. We have to keep practicing discernment. And if I'm never going to be perfect at it, it should probably remind me to be humble as I'm practicing it. If I'm learning over a lifetime what is true and what is false, I should remember to be humble along the way. I think we find a great reminder of this in 1 Kings 3, where we see Solomon asking for wisdom from God as he begins his reign as king. He says, "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" Man, it's just such a great attitude from Solomon here at the beginning of his reign, how conscious he is of his lack, his need for supernatural help, because his human discernment just isn't enough. It's a great attitude for us as well. Augustine wrote regarding discernment and the need at times to condemn evil, and he said, "Be neither consenting to evil so as to approve it, nor negligent so as to not reprove it, nor proud so as to reprove it in a tone of insult." So let me translate that into modern English here this morning. Augustine is saying, don't approve of evil. If you're doing discernment as a Christian, there are times where you're just going to have to say, this is evil and I need to stay away from it. And he says, don't choose not to reprove it. So in other words, sometimes you're going to have to call out evil. There are going to be times where you have to say, this is evil and I'm staying away. And there are going to be moments where it's appropriate for you to say to someone else, this is evil and you should stay away too. But he adds that third element of don't reprove evil. Don't say, hey, stay away from this, in a way that says, I am better than you and I have this all figured out. I don't need to worry about falling for the wrong thing. I don't need to worry about any of this because I've already got this figured out. So Augustine says, practice discernment. Learn when it's time to stay away from evil or even reprove evil. But when you have to do it, don't do it in a way that says, I have this all figured out and I have no flaws or faults or foibles, etc. One last note on practicing discernment, and that's the simple question, how do I grow in this? How do I get better at this? What is the plan? If you're doing the athletic analogy, what are the exercises that are going to get me to where I want to go in this? And in Philippians 4:9, Paul said, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Go find mature Christians who are already good at this and talk to them about it. Find folks who seem strangely unmoored from the loyalties of this world, who speak the truth about hard topics with both courage and humility, whose priorities seem off from the priorities of the world around them, but who seem soaked in Scripture and in the Bible. And seek Christians of other backgrounds and persuasions. We need each other. Remember, it's never too late to grow in this, to learn, to practice discernment. Younger Christians, you and newer Christians, you need the perspective and experience of older Christians, those who have run the race further. Younger brothers and sisters, seek mentors who have run more of the race than you have. But older Christians, you should probably note who those crochet scams were seeking to rip off. Wow, I thought I'd get a lot more laughter there. But there are bad actors in the world today that those the age of your children, grandchildren, 20, 40 years younger than you, they just know to avoid that without even having to think about it. Get help from each other across generational divides and cultural divides and all those different things. You won't know where your blind spots are unless you talk to other people who have different blind spots. So work with each other. Older Christians, listen to the younger ones. Take their perspective and weigh it against Scripture. Remember, we always weigh things against Scripture, but weigh it against Scripture the same way that you would someone of your own group, your own generation, whatever divide it is that we're weighing it across. And finally, as we practice discernment, remember what it's for. 1 Thessalonians 5:22, test everything, hold fast what is good. So often we box up discernment as the thing that shows us all the evil, all the bad in the world, and tells us to stay away from it. And that is certainly a part of it. That's part of the job of discernment. But it can't be, and it isn't all of it. We cannot be people defined wholly and entirely by what we are against. Brothers and sisters, your growth in discernment should show you new sources of joy, new avenues for beauty, new motivations for praise. Discernment's ultimate goal is not figuring out who to turn the cannons on, it's who to turn our eyes toward. It's finding and dwelling on the things that are noble and good and pure and whole and right and true. So seek a discernment that sees with the eyes of joy, eyes of excitement, eyes of praise, eyes that dwell on God and on the good gifts that He's given us. The Westminster Shorter Catechism answers the question, what is the purpose of humanity? It says humanity's purpose is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So we're supposed to practice a discernment that brings us the joy of seeing God more clearly and appreciating more fully what He has done for us in Jesus and the good gifts He's given us in creation.